The shovel bit into the creek bank with a wet, sucking sound. Elias leaned his weight into the handle, his boots sinking into the soft gray earth. Each shovelful was heavy, dense with water and the memory of ancient riverbeds. He tossed the clay onto a growing pile on a heavy canvas tarp, the motion a practiced rhythm of dig, lift, turn, release. Beside him, Boro, an old dog whose coat was the color of dried winter grass, watched with intelligent, patient eyes. The dog sighed, a soft huff of air, and rested his chin on his paws, accepting this new, strange ritual as he had accepted all the others. This was the third week of digging. The pile of raw clay now stood waist-high, a lumpy, primal monument to a singular, silent obsession. This land, this small cabin nestled in a high valley, was all that was left. His parents were gone, taken by a fever that had swept through the county the previous winter, leaving behind only the quiet echo of their lives and a collection of books filled with his father's careful, spidery handwriting. It was in one of those journals, tucked between notes on crop rotation and weather patterns, that Elias had found it. A detailed, multi-page entry on something his father had seen during his time in the old country. A kachelofen, a tile stove, a masonry heater. The sketches were meticulous, showing a labyrinth of channels and baffles coiling behind a simple iron firebox door. The notes described a principle that felt like alchemy. You burned a small, hot fire for only 2 hours. The immense thermal mass of the stove, tons of brick, clay, and stone, would absorb nearly all the heat, letting only cool, clean gases escape the chimney. Then, for the next 24 hours, the stove would radiate a gentle, pervasive warmth, heating the entire house without a single visible flame. It was a battery for heat. A rattling sound from the dirt road pulled Elias from his work. Mr. Gable's old pickup truck slowed to a stop, kicking up a plume of late summer dust. Gable, a man whose face was a road map of 60 winters, leaned his arm out the window and squinted at the pile of clay. "Elias," he called out, his voice raspy from a lifetime of cold mornings. "What in God's name are you doing?" Elias straightened, wiping a smear of mud from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Digging clay, Mr. Gable." "I can see that," Gable said, his skepticism a tangible force. He killed the engine and climbed out, his boots crunching on the gravel. He was a man who understood cords of wood, the roar of a forced air furnace, the steady consumption of propane. He did not understand a young man digging a mountain of mud. He walked over, peered at the pile, then glanced toward the cabin, where a new stone foundation, square and massive, occupied the center of the main room. "That's the craziest thing I've ever seen. What are you building in there? A tomb?" "A stove," Elias said quietly. Gable let out a short, incredulous laugh. "A stove? A stove made of mud? Son, I've lived in this valley my whole life. I know what winter is. That thing, whatever it is, will be a block of ice by November. You'll freeze before Christmas." He pointed a thick, work-worn finger at the pile. "You need a proper wood stove, a good cast iron one, something that'll throw heat you can feel." "This will work," Elias said. It wasn't an argument. It was a statement of fact, as solid and immovable as the foundation he had laid. "Wait until winter," Gable said, shaking his head. He climbed back into his truck, the springs groaning in protest. "Don't be too proud to ask for help when you're shivering, you hear?" The truck rumbled back to life and disappeared down the road. Elias watched him go. He looked at Boro, who lifted his head and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before settling back down. The dog trusted him. That was enough. He picked up the shovel and went back to work. The sun was warm on his back, but he could already feel the whisper of autumn in the breeze, a promise of the cold to come. The doubt of his neighbors was a wall he could not see, but the stove was a wall he could. He would build it, brick by brick, proving his father's knowledge not with words, but with warmth. The work consumed him. He sold his father's tractor and most of the heavy farm equipment, a decision that caused more than a few murmurs in town. The money went to a truckload of dense, pale fire bricks from a specialty supplier 2 states away, and bags of grog, fire clay, and silica sand. The rest he sourced himself. He hauled river stone for the foundation and sand from the bend in the creek, washing it meticulously in a series of settling barrels. His life became a cycle of heavy things, the hauling, the mixing, the lifting. His hands, already calloused from farm work, grew thick and tough. The skin on his knuckles split and bled, healing into a permanent, hardened shield. He began the core first, the firebox, laying the fire bricks with a reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. Each brick was set perfectly level, the gaps between them no more than 1/16 of an inch, filled with a thin slurry of refractory mortar. It was slow, exacting work. Boro would lie on the cool dirt floor just outside the foundation, watching Elias's every move. Some days Elias spoke to him, not in conversation, but in quiet affirmations. "This one holds the fire," he'd murmur, tapping a brick into place. "This is the heart." From the firebox, he began to construct the labyrinth. He was not just laying bricks, he was sculpting a path for heat. The hot gases would leave the firebox, rise into a first chamber, then be forced down a long channel, then up another, then sideways through a third, a serpentine route that stretched for nearly 30 feet within the stove's massive body. By the time the smoke finally reached the chimney flue, it would be cool enough to hold your hand in. All its energy, its lifeblood of heat, would have been absorbed by the masonry. Mr. Gable would stop by every week or so, a self-appointed inspector of folly. He'd stand in the doorway, arms crossed, and watch Elias painstakingly mortar another section of the convoluted flue system. "Still at it, I see," he'd say. "Looks like the guts of some great beast. You sure you know what you're doing? One mistake in that maze and you'll fill the house with smoke, kill you in your sleep." "I have a plan," Elias would reply, not looking up from his trowel. He was following his father's drawings, each measurement triple-checked, each angle precise. He wasn't inventing, he was remembering. He was building a memory. One afternoon, a different vehicle pulled up. It was a modest sedan, and a young woman got out. It was Clara, who worked at the county library. She held a book in her hand. "Elias," she said, her voice clear and calm. "I saw you were on the wait list for this. The Principles of Thermal Mass. It just came in." Elias wiped his hands on a rag and came to the door, surprised. He had forgotten he'd even requested it. He took the book, his rough fingers brushing against hers. "Thank you." Her eyes went past him, to the half-finished structure that now dominated the small cabin. Unlike Gable, her expression wasn't one of mockery or pity. It was one of genuine curiosity. "Is that what I think it is?" she asked. "A masonry heater?" Elias nodded, wary. "My grandfather was from Finland," she said. "They had something similar, a tulisia. He said you could heat the whole house all day with just a few armloads of wood. He said it was a gentle heat, like standing in the sun." She stepped just inside the doorway, her gaze tracing the complex network of flues. "How does it work?" For the first time, Elias explained it to someone. He didn't use many words, pointing more than speaking. "The fire burns here. The heat travels all the way through, for a long time. The bricks hold it." "And the outside?" she asked, gesturing to the piles of creek clay he was now processing, kneading and shaping into rough 6-inch squares. "Tiles," he said, "to cover it." She smiled, a small, genuine smile that seemed to warm the air more than the autumn sun filtering through the dusty windows. "It's incredible. It's a work of art." She didn't say he was crazy. She didn't tell him to wait until winter. She looked at the massive, strange object and saw not madness, but purpose. When she left, the silence in the cabin felt different. It was no longer the silence of isolation, but of quiet, shared understanding. He spent the next 2 weeks making the tiles. He built a temporary kiln outside, a small domed oven of brick and mud, and fired the clay squares he had painstakingly formed. They came out a warm, earthy terracotta, each one unique, bearing the faint imprint of his fingers. He began to clad the stove, covering the rough inner brickwork with a skin of beautiful handmade tile. It was no longer just a functional machine. It was becoming the soul of the house. By late October, it was finished. The stove stood 7 feet tall, 4 feet wide, and 6 feet deep, a behemoth of reddish-brown tile that seems to have grown from the very foundation of the cabin. A simple, black cast-iron door was set into its face. A small bench, also made of tile, curved around one side. The Liegeplatz, his father's notes had called it, the lying-down place. It was the warmest spot. He needed to cure it slowly, with a series of small, escalating fires, to drive the moisture out of the tons of masonry without cracking it. The first fire was nothing more than a bundle of newspapers. Boro watched the process with intense focus, his nose twitching. The next day, a handful of kindling. The day after, a few small logs. A thin wisp of steam rose from the mortar joints, the stove sweating out its own birth. Mr. Gable saw the smoke from the chimney and stopped by, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "Finally gave up on that mud pile and put in a real fire, eh?" he said, peering inside. He saw the tiny fire burning in the iron firebox. He put his hand on the tile surface of the stove, a foot away from the flames. He frowned. "It's cold." "It's absorbing," Elias said. "It's absorbing, he says," Gable muttered to himself as he walked away. "It's a damn heat sink is what it is. It'll suck every bit of warmth out of this house and send it straight to China." Elias ignored him. He continued the curing fires for 10 days. The stove stopped steaming. The tiles became warm to the touch, then hot. But Gable was right in one respect. It didn't throw heat like a normal stove. It didn't have a blistering metal surface that you couldn't get near. The warmth was a presence, a feeling, not an assault. After a 2-hour fire, the tiles would be hot enough that you couldn't rest your hand on them for long, but they wouldn't burn you. And they would stay that way for hours and hours, long after the fire was nothing but a bed of cold ash. The first real cold snap arrived in mid-November. The temperature dropped into the 20s overnight. In the morning, Elias loaded the firebox with a precise amount of seasoned oak, about 30 pounds, an armload. He lit it. The draft was perfect. The fire roared inside its ceramic chamber, a contained inferno. For 2 hours, the fire burned with ferocious intensity. Elias watched it through the small glass window in the door, a vortex of orange and yellow. Then, as the last log turned to glowing embers, he closed the chimney damper, sealing the entire system. The fire was over. But the work of the stove had just begun. An hour later, the entire surface was a solid, radiating panel of warmth. The air in the cabin, which had been a brisk 50 degrees, slowly climbed. 60, 65. By noon, it was a steady 70 degrees, and the stove's surface was a constant, comforting 150 degrees. Boro discovered the tiled bench and claimed it as his own, stretching out with a groan of pure bliss. Elias sat at the kitchen table, drinking a cup of tea in his shirt sleeves, the house filled with a silent, invisible blanket of heat. There was no fire crackling, no blower humming, just warmth. The real test, however, was yet to come. The old-timers felt it in their bones. The squirrels had been frantic all fall, hoarding nuts with a desperate energy. The geese had flown south a month early. The air in early December grew unnaturally still and heavy, the sky a strange metallic gray. Mr. Gable stopped his truck one afternoon, not to mock, but to warn. "Ice is coming," he said, his voice low. "A bad one. The kind that brings the trees down. The kind that snaps the power lines. You got enough wood to last you a week?" "I have enough," Elias said. He had 3 cords stacked and dry, but he knew he wouldn't need a fraction of what Gable would burn through in his drafty old farmhouse with its inefficient iron stove. "Check your generator. Make sure you got fuel." "I don't have a generator," Elias said. Gable stared at him, his face a mask of disbelief. "No generator? Boy, are you trying to die?" He drove off, shaking his head more furiously than ever. The storm began not with snow, but with a cold, persistent rain. The temperature hovered at 33 degrees, then 32. Then it dropped to 31. The rain kept falling, but it was no longer water. It was ice. It coated every branch, every wire, every blade of grass in a clear, perfect sheath. The world outside Elias's window was being transformed into a glass sculpture. That afternoon, Elias had burned his daily fire. The stove was fully charged, a silent sentinel of warmth in the heart of the cabin. As dusk fell, the terrible sounds began. A sharp crack, like a rifle shot, as a heavy, ice-laden branch gave way. Then a deeper groan and a tremendous crash as a whole tree fell somewhere in the woods. The power flickered once, twice, and then went out for good. A profound darkness and silence fell over the valley, broken only by the continuous, terrifying sound of the forest shattering around them. Boro whined softly, pressing against Elias's leg. Elias stroked the dog's head, his own heart beating a little faster. He lit a single oil lamp. Its small flame cast dancing shadows on the walls, but the room itself was filled with the steady, unwavering warmth of the cockalofen. He put his hand on its tiled surface. It felt alive, a great, warm-blooded creature sleeping in his home. Outside, the world was breaking apart in a crystalline cataclysm. Inside, it was 72 degrees. Elias sat in a chair, listening to the storm, and waited. He slept on a cot near the stove, Boro curled up on the tile bench. He woke once in the night to a tremendous crash nearby, the old oak at the edge of his property finally succumbing to the weight of the ice. The house shuddered. But the air remained warm, the silence inside a stark contrast to the chaos without. Morning came, but the light was strange, refracted through the thick coating of ice that covered every window pane. The valley was unrecognizable. It was a world of glass, beautiful and lethal. Every tree was bowed to the ground or broken, the power lines dangling in thick, icy ropes. There was no sign of life, no smoke from any chimney. The silence was absolute. Elias made coffee on a small camp stove. He and Boro were an island of warmth and normalcy in a sea of frozen devastation. He knew the others would be in trouble. Their furnaces, reliant on electricity for blowers and pumps, would be silent. Their cast-iron stoves, voracious in their appetite for wood, would demand constant feeding, and even then, they would only heat a small circle around them, leaving the rest of the house to freeze. Their pipes would be bursting. Their fuel would be running low. Around 10 o'clock, he saw movement. A figure, bundled and struggling, was making its way slowly up his driveway. The figure slipped and fell, got up, and kept coming. As it drew closer, Elias saw it was Mr. Gable. Elias opened the door. Gable stumbled inside, bringing a blast of frigid air with him. His face was pale, his lips tinged with blue. His breath came in ragged clouds. He looked around the room, his eyes wide with disbelief. Elias was standing there in a long-sleeved shirt. There was no fire. There was no noise. But a wave of gentle, profound warmth washed over him. "How?" Gable stammered, peeling off his frozen gloves. "My stove. It's been eating wood all night. I can't keep the house above 40. Martha's sick. She's shivering under every blanket we own. I came to... I don't know. I thought you'd be frozen solid. I came to check on you." His eyes fell on the massive tile stove. He walked over to it, his movements stiff, and placed a trembling hand on its surface. A look of pure, unadulterated shock spread across his face. It was not just warm, it was a deep, living heat. "It's been 12 hours since the fire went out," Elias said simply. Gable just stared at the stove, then back at Elias. The skepticism that had been etched onto his face for months was gone, replaced by something else: awe and desperation. "Elias," he said, his voice cracking, Can you help us?" "Bring Martha here," Elias said. "Bring anyone who needs it." It took Gable an hour to get back with his wife, who was wrapped in a cocoon of blankets, her face drawn and ill. Elias settled her on the cot near the stove, and a little color slowly returned to her cheeks. She looked at the stove, then at Elias, and whispered, "It's like sunshine." Word must have spread, or perhaps desperation was its own messenger. By afternoon, more people arrived. The Sterlings, who owned the largest, most modern house in the valley, a house that was now a grand, frozen tomb. The Miller family, with their 3 young children. A dozen people, then 15, found refuge in Elias's small cabin. They brought what food they had. They huddled not around the stove, but simply existed within its sphere of influence, their bodies slowly unthawing, their fear receding with the cold. They stared at the kachelofen as if it were a religious artifact. They touched its tiles. They asked the same questions. But where is the fire? How does it stay so warm? Elias didn't say much. He just kept the coffee pot on the camp stove and let the heater do the talking. That evening, with the cabin full of his neighbors, the people who had called him insane, Mr. Gable sat on a stool beside Elias. He watched the children sleeping peacefully on blankets on the floor. He looked at his wife, who was breathing easily for the first time in a day. He turned to Elias, his eyes full of a humility the young man had never seen in him before.
"I'm sorry, son," Gable said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was a fool. An old, stubborn fool. You tried to tell me and I wouldn't listen."
He gestured around the warm, safe room.
"This thing you built, it didn't just save you. It saved all of us."
Elias just nodded. There was nothing else to say. He looked at the stove, his father's impossible idea made real, its silent, steady warmth a testament to the enduring power of quiet knowledge and patient hands. The thaw came 4 days later. The power would be out for another 2 weeks, but the immediate crisis was over. As people began to return to their cold, damaged homes, they did not just offer thanks. They came with questions, with notebooks, with a newfound hunger for the wisdom they had once mocked. Mr. Sterling, a man accustomed to writing checks to solve problems, approached Elias with a proposal. "I'll buy the materials," he said, his tone stripped of its usual arrogance. "Fire bricks, mortar, whatever it takes.
If you'll teach us, if you'll show us how to build these." And so, Elias became a teacher. He never sought the role, but it was given to him. That next summer, he did not build one stove, but oversaw the construction of 3 more in the valley. He shared his father's journals, translating the meticulous notes and drawings into practical lessons. He taught Mr. Gable how to lay a fire brick with a paper-thin joint. He showed the Miller boys how to mix the clay mortar to the perfect consistency. He wasn't a charismatic leader. He was a quiet guide, his authority rooted not in words, but in the undeniable success of his creation. 5 winters came and went. The valley changed. The sight of a massive tiled stove in the center of a living room became a common sight. The houses were no longer just shelters from the cold, they were reservoirs of warmth. The community, once reliant on a fragile, faraway power grid and endless cords of firewood, found a resilient, self-sufficient heart. They called them Elias stoves. He would always correct them gently. They're masonry heaters. But the name stuck. Clara became a constant presence in his life. She brought him books, but she also brought him conversation and companionship. They were married in the cabin on a bright autumn day, standing before the stove that had, in its own way, brought them together. Their children were born in that cabin, and they spent their earliest days sleeping in a cradle placed in the gentle, steady warmth of the tiled bench. Burro grew old. His muzzle turned white, his steps became slow and deliberate. He spent most of his days sleeping on his tile bench, his favorite spot in the world. One spring morning, when the world was green and new again, he did not wake up. He had passed peacefully in his sleep, in the warm heart of the home he had watched Elias build. Elias carried his old friend in his arms, the body still and light, and buried him under the tall oak at the edge of the property, the one that had survived the ice storm. He carved a simple B into the bark of the tree. He felt the loss like a missing limb, the absence of the silent, trusting witness who had been with him from the very first shovelful of clay. Years turned into decades. Elias's hair turned the color of ash. His hands, the hands that had built a new future for the valley, became gnarled with arthritis. He walked with a slight stoop. He and Clara watched their children grow and build homes of their own, each one anchored by a masonry heater. He became the valley's quiet patriarch, a living legend who was uncomfortable with the title. People would bring their children to see the original stove, to touch the terracotta tiles that still bore the faint prints of his fingers. He would sit in his chair, near the warmth, and tell them the story, not as a boast, but as a simple history. "My father knew how," he would say. "I just had the plans." He died as Burro had, peacefully in his sleep, on a cold winter's night, the house a steady 70 degrees from a fire that had gone out hours before. Clara lived another 10 years, her presence a continuation of the cabin's gentle warmth. They were buried beside each other in the small-town cemetery, in a plot that looked out over the valley. Their children placed a simple granite headstone for Elias. It didn't list dates or accomplishments in the traditional sense. It just said, "Elias, he built with patience and warmed us all." A century passed. The valley thrived. The world outside grew more complex, its technologies more dazzling and more fragile. But in the high valley, the knowledge of the stoves endured, passed down from generation to generation. The original cabin became a local museum,
a monument to a quiet man who had listened to the wisdom of the past. On a cold January afternoon, a great-granddaughter of one of the families Elias had sheltered during the great ice storm brought her own child to see the cabin. The air outside was sharp and biting, the ground covered in a thick blanket of snow. She pushed open the heavy oak door. Inside, there was no sound of a fire, no hum of a furnace. There was only a profound and gentle warmth. In the center of the room stood the cockalofen, its terracotta tiles glowing softly in the winter light. It looked ancient and eternal, a testament not to a single man, but to an idea, that with patience, with knowledge, and with hands willing to do the work, one could build a lasting warmth that could hold back the coldest of winters, a warmth that could shelter a family and even save a community. The child, too young to understand the history, walked over to the stove and placed her small hands on the tiles. She smiled, feeling the gentle, sun-like heat. It felt like home.